My name is Elena Torres. I'm 32 years old, and Margaret never apologized for that dinner. I didn't know that night would change everything. If you'd asked me then, sitting at the far end of Margaret Whitmore's dining table, hands folded neatly in my lap like I was trying not to take up space, I would have told you it was just another dinner. Another evening of polite smiles that never quite reached anyone's eyes. Another reminder that, in that house, I was tolerated, never embraced. But humiliation has a way of burning memories into you with perfect clarity. I remember the chandelier first. Crystal. Imported. Margaret liked to mention that part. It hung over the table like a crown, throwing sharp light onto the polished wood, making sure no flaw, especially me, went unnoticed. "Daniel," Margaret said, swirling her wine slowly, deliberately, "tell your wife what Richard and I were discussing earlier." My husband shifted beside me. Daniel always did that when his mother spoke, like a boy waiting to be told whether he'd passed or failed. He glanced at me, then back at her. "Mom, it's not really—" "Oh, nonsense," she interrupted, smiling sweetly. "We're family." That word, family. She used it like a weapon. I felt my shoulders tense. Something in my gut told me this wasn't going to end well. Margaret's eyes flicked to me, assessing, measuring. The way a woman looks at something she believes is beneath her but still mildly irritating. "We were talking about ambition," she said. "About drive." Her gaze lingered. "And how some people simply don't have it." The table went quiet. I smiled anyway. I had learned how to do that. Smile, breathe, survive. "I think ambition looks different for everyone," I said carefully. Margaret laughed, not loudly. Not cruelly, at least not on the surface. It was worse than that. It was amused. "Oh, Elena," she said, leaning back in her chair. "That's something people say when they've settled." Settled. Daniel stared at his plate. Richard cleared his throat but said nothing. And just like that, I was alone. Margaret gestured around the table. "Clara's promotion came through last week. Senior director at 32. Daniel's firm just landed another six-figure client. Even I still sit on 3 nonprofit boards." Then she looked at me again. "And you," she continued, voice smooth as silk, "are still figuring things out." I felt heat creep up my neck. "I run a consulting business," I said quietly. She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, sweetheart, freelancing doesn't count." There it was. The humiliation didn't come all at once. It came in layers. Each word peeling away dignity I hadn't realized I was still clinging to. Margaret turned to Clara. "Did you know Elena once told me she was going to build something big?" Clara laughed into her napkin. Daniel finally looked up. "Mom!" Margaret held up a manicured hand. "I'm only saying this because I care. A woman should contribute meaningfully, especially when she marries into a family like ours." That sentence landed like a slap. A family like ours. Something inside me cracked, but I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't storm out. I did what I had always done. I stayed quiet. Because what Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman she was humiliating at her table already owned the ground beneath her feet. And she had no idea she was sitting on my success. Margaret never apologized for that dinner. Not the next morning, not the next week, not ever. And the truth is, she didn't think she had done anything wrong. In her mind, humiliation wasn't cruelty, it was correction. A way of reminding people where they stood. And according to Margaret Whitmore, I stood somewhere near the bottom. Useful enough to marry her son, quiet enough not to embarrass the family, and small enough to ignore. The woman they thought I was, let me tell you about her. They thought I was timid because I spoke softly. They thought I was unambitious because I didn't brag. They thought I was dependent because I never corrected them, and I let them, because silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it's strategy. But back then, no one in that family believed I was capable of strategy. The morning after the dinner, Daniel tried to smooth things over the way he always did, by pretending nothing had happened. "Mom didn't mean it like that," he said as he tied his tie in the mirror. "You know how she is." I sat on the edge of the bed, watching him struggle with the knot. "I do know how she is," I replied. That's the problem, he sighed, the sound heavy with inconvenience rather than concern. She's just traditional. Number Margaret wasn't traditional. She was territorial. And I was an outsider who hadn't earned the right, in her eyes, to exist comfortably in her world. When Daniel left, I stayed seated long after the door closed. I stared at the quiet apartment, the one Margaret loved to remind me they had helped us get. What she didn't mention was that I paid every cent of our mortgage, not from Daniel's income, from mine. But to them, money only counted if it arrived loudly. I went into my office, what Margaret called the guest room with a laptop, and powered up my computer. Overnight, I had received 3 emails. One from Singapore, one from Berlin, one from New York, each confirming contracts, each worth more than Daniel's monthly salary. I stared at the screen, then leaned back in my chair. If Margaret could see me now, she'd still find a way to dismiss it. That's the thing about people who underestimate you. They don't want to be proven wrong. They want reality to bend around their assumptions. And for years, I let it. Because before I married Daniel Whitmore, before I ever sat at that dinner table, I had learned a lesson that shaped everything about me. Visibility invites interference. I hadn't always been invisible. Once I had been loud. Once I had been ambitious in a way that scared people. And once that had cost me everything. They didn't know that part of my story. Not Margaret, not Clara, not even Daniel. They didn't know that when I smiled and nodded, it wasn't submission, it was restraint. And they definitely didn't know that the woman they were so comfortable dismissing had already walked away from power once and survived. Daniel came home late that night. Another client dinner. Another story about his firm, his success, his future. He talked. I listened. That had become our rhythm. "You should come next time," he said casually. "My colleagues' wives usually do." I looked up. "Do you want me there?" He hesitated. "I mean, it would look good." There it was again, looking good, not being valued, not being respected, just being presentable. "I'll think about it," I said. He nodded, relieved, thinking, as always, that the conversation was over. But inside me, something was shifting. Not anger, not resentment. Clarity. Because the truth I hadn't wanted to admit, about Daniel, about his mother, about that entire polished world, was finally impossible to ignore. They didn't see me. And more importantly, they didn't want to. That realization hurt more than Margaret's words ever could. A week later, we attended another family gathering. This time at Richard and Margaret's country club. White tablecloths, champagne flutes, the kind of place where laughter was controlled and reputations mattered more than honesty. Margaret greeted me with an air kiss that didn't quite land. "Elena," she said, "you look comfortable." It was an insult dressed as a compliment. I wore it like armor. Clara cornered me near the bar. "Still consulting?" she asked, swirling her drink. "Must be nice to have hobbies." I smiled. "It is." She laughed, already bored, already certain she knew everything about me. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed something strange. Margaret kept introducing me incorrectly. "This is Elena, Daniel's wife. She doesn't work right now." The first time, I corrected her gently. The second time, I didn't. The third time, I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was narrative control. Margaret needed me to be small because if I wasn't, if I turned out to be something more, then her judgments would be wrong. And Margaret Whitmore did not survive on being wrong. That was the moment I made a quiet decision. I would stop correcting them. I would let them believe every false thing they wanted. Because people reveal their true selves when they think you're powerless. And Margaret was already revealing far more than she realized. Later that evening, as Daniel chatted with his father, Margaret pulled me aside. "I hope you didn't take my comments personally last week," she said, lips tight with insincerity. "I just worry about you." I met her eyes. "I know," I said softly. She blinked. She hadn't expected agreement. "I only want what's best for Daniel," she continued. "He comes from a certain standard." I nodded again. "And you?" she asked. "Don't you want more for yourself?" I thought about the companies quietly operating under shell names. the assets registered under holding groups, the accounts no one in that room even suspected existed. "I already have everything I need," I replied. Margaret smiled, thin, triumphant. "Of course you do." She walked away satisfied, and I stood there, watching her retreat into a crowd that adored her, knowing something she didn't. People like Margaret mistake silence for surrender. But silence is where plans grow, and mine was already in motion. People assume marriages fall apart because of screaming matches or betrayal. Mine didn't. Mine eroded quietly, one unspoken expectation at a time. Daniel and I hadn't started this way. That's the part people never understand. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He wasn't even particularly selfish in obvious ways. He was comfortable. And comfort, I learned too late, can be just as suffocating as control. When we met, Daniel loved that I was low maintenance, that I didn't need the spotlight, that I didn't challenge him. "You're different," he told me once early on. "Not like the women at work who are always trying to prove something." I remember smiling when he said that. I didn't realize he was telling me exactly how small he needed me to stay. After we married, the pattern set in quickly. His job came first, not because he demanded it, but because it was assumed. Client dinners, weekend conferences, emergency calls during holidays. My work adjusted around his life. His never adjusted around mine. At first, I told myself this was normal. This was partnership. This was compromise. But compromise, when only one person is bending, becomes something else entirely. Daniel liked to talk about success. He liked to be seen as someone on the rise, someone important. What he didn't like was competition, especially not from his wife. The first time I landed a major contract after our marriage, I made the mistake of telling him how big it was. "That's great," he said, distracted, "but just make sure it doesn't interfere with our plans next month." Our plans, a trip to see his parents. I learned quickly to downplay my wins. When I traveled internationally for work, I called it a small consulting thing. When money came in, I let it disappear quietly into shared accounts and household expenses. When my network grew, I didn't mention names. Daniel never asked for details anyway. In his world, my role was supportive background noise, something stable and unthreatening. Margaret noticed this dynamic immediately. She encouraged it. "Elena is so grounded," she'd say to friends. "Not career-obsessed. Daniel needs that. Needs that." As if my ambition was something dangerous that had been mercifully subdued. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel would complain about his job. "The pressure is insane," he'd say. "Everyone's trying to outdo each other." I'd listen. I'd nod. I'd offer solutions he never took. He never asked about my day. And when he did, it was with the expectation of a short answer. "Good," I'd say, or "busy." Both were true. Neither were complete. The truth was, my work was expanding faster than I'd planned. I was building something layered, intentionally opaque. Not because I was hiding, but because I had learned, painfully, that visibility attracts predators. Years before Daniel, I had trusted the wrong people. I had watched ideas get stolen, credit redirected, doors quietly closed once others realized what I had. I survived that by disappearing, by starting over under different names, by structuring ownership so no single face became a target, by letting louder people take center stage while I retained control. Daniel never knew that version of me. By the time we met, I had already decided that my personal life would never intersect dangerously with my professional one. He liked it that way. Margaret loved it that way. The more invisible I became, the more comfortable everyone else grew. But invisibility has a cost. I stopped being invited into decisions, stopped being consulted, stopped being considered. At family gatherings, conversations flowed around me, not to me. When I spoke, people smiled politely and moved on. Daniel didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and decided it was easier not to. One night, after another dinner where Margaret had paraded Clara's achievements like trophies while ignoring my existence entirely, I finally said something. "Does it bother you," I asked Daniel carefully, "the way your mother talks about me?" He didn't look up from his phone. She doesn't talk about you. She just doesn't focus on you. That was his defense, as if being erased was preferable to being criticized. I'm your wife, I said. Don't you think I deserve some respect? He sighed. Why do you need validation from her? It was a fair question, and a dangerous one, because it forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. I didn't need validation from Margaret. I needed it from him, and I wasn't getting it. The night things truly changed wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a sentence. We were lying in bed, lights off, the space between us larger than the mattress. You're lucky, Daniel said casually, that you don't have the pressure I do. I stared at the ceiling. Lucky. I thought about the risks I carried alone, the responsibility, the employees who depended on me, the deals that could collapse if I miscalculated. I thought about the way I held entire systems together quietly while being treated like an accessory in my own marriage. Yes, I said softly, I'm very lucky. He rolled over, satisfied. And in that moment, something inside me withdrew. Not bitterness, resolve. Because I finally understood the truth. Daniel didn't love me for who I was. He loved me for who I didn't force him to become. And Margaret sensed that imbalance and exploited it expertly. She praised Daniel constantly. She minimized me subtly. She framed everything as concern while stripping away authority. And Daniel, whether out of fear, habit, or comfort, let her. By the time I realized how small my world had become, it wasn't because they were pushing me down. It was because I had stopped pushing back. But here's what they never understood. I wasn't shrinking. I was conserving energy. Because when you've been underestimated long enough, you learn the value of timing. And my timing was getting closer. Margaret Whitmore didn't bully people the way you see in movies. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult you outright. She didn't give anyone proof to point at. Margaret specialized in plausible deniability. If you confronted her, she would look genuinely wounded, offended, even that you'd misunderstood her intentions. I was only trying to help. I didn't realize you were so sensitive. I thought we were close enough for honesty. Those were her favorite phrases, and she wielded them with surgical precision. It took me years to recognize the pattern, not because it was subtle, but because I didn't want to believe someone could be that calculated. Margaret's favorite game was comparison. She never attacked you directly. She simply elevated someone else while glancing in your direction. Clara has such drive. Daniel really inherited Richard's ambition. I admire women who contribute. Each sentence landed softly. Together they crushed, and she never played alone. Margaret collected allies the way others collected jewelry. Carefully chosen, always polished, always positioned to reflect her image. At family events, she'd pull women aside and whisper just loudly enough for me to hear. I worry about Elena. She doesn't seem fulfilled. Fulfilled. As if fulfillment was something Margaret got to define. People nodded sympathetically. They always did, because Margaret was generous, influential, respected, and I was quiet. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone. She was in the sunroom, glass doors open. I was in the hallway about to pass by when I heard my name. Elena! Oh, she's sweet, Margaret said. Just not motivated. I stopped walking. She's very dependent on Daniel. I worry what would happen if something ever went wrong. That one hurt more than the rest. Not because it was cruel, but because it was strategic. Margaret wasn't just humiliating me socially. She was laying groundwork, creating a narrative where I was fragile, unprepared, lesser. Why? At the time, I thought it was about control, about ego. I didn't realize yet that it was about protection. Margaret needed people to believe I was incapable. Because if anyone looked too closely, if anyone asked the wrong questions, her carefully constructed world would start to wobble. I noticed things after that, small inconsistencies. Margaret loved to talk about the family's legacy, about how Richard had built everything from the ground up. But when I asked casual questions, dates, transitions, early investors, the answers were always vague. Oh, that was ages ago. Records weren't as detailed back then. Richard handled all of that. Richard, I noticed, never corrected her. In fact, he rarely spoke at all. At dinners, he deferred to Margaret constantly. When she told a story, he nodded. When she made a claim, he agreed. But sometimes, very rarely, I caught a flicker of something else in his eyes. Not pride, unease. Margaret's control extended beyond me. She managed information the way others managed finances. Clara once complained to me after a few drinks. "Mom has opinions about everything," she said. "Who I date, where I work, how much I should earn." I waited. "She even reviews my contracts," Clara continued, rolling her eyes. "Says it's to protect me." That got my attention. "Why would she need to?" I asked lightly. Clara shrugged. "She's just always been involved." Always involved. That was Margaret's real power. Not money, not status. Access. She inserted herself everywhere, finances, decisions, narratives, until people couldn't remember what autonomy felt like. Daniel was the same. He ran big deals at work, but still called his mother for advice on investments. Margaret framed it as care. "I just want to make sure he doesn't make mistakes." Mistakes like independence. The more I observed, the clearer it became. Margaret didn't just want influence. She wanted ownership. And she had built her reputation around being the invisible hand guiding everyone else's success. Everyone except me, because she couldn't guide what she couldn't see, and she couldn't see me. One evening, during a charity gala Margaret chaired, something happened that confirmed my growing suspicion. A donor approached me. "You're Elena, right?" he asked. "The consultant." I smiled. "Yes," Margaret appeared instantly at my side. "Oh, Elena just dabbles," she said brightly. "Daniel's career keeps her busy." The man frowned. "Really?" "That's not what I heard." Margaret's smile tightened. "I was told," he continued, "that you were instrumental in restructuring the Eastbridge acquisition." I said nothing. Margaret laughed. Too loudly. "Oh, people exaggerate." But the damage was done. For the first time, I saw fear flash across her face. Not anger, not disdain. Fear. That moment replayed in my mind for weeks. Because it confirmed something I had been circling subconsciously. Margaret wasn't just cruel. She was hiding. And whatever she was hiding required me to remain small. After that night, her behavior toward me changed. She became nicer. Too nice. Invitations, compliments. Sudden interest in my little projects. Predators don't change tactics unless they sense a shift in power. And Margaret had sensed something. She just didn't know how much. What she couldn't possibly imagine, what none of them could, was that my silence had never been accidental. And the longer she underestimated me, the more evidence she handed me freely. Margaret's favorite game was humiliation. Mine was observation, and I was winning. There are some truths you don't share, not because you're ashamed, but because once spoken, they can be taken from you. I learned that lesson the hard way, long before I married Daniel. Long before I ever sat at Margaret Whitmore's table, pretending not to notice her contempt. Back when I still believed that merit protected you. That intelligence spoke for itself. That good work guaranteed fair treatment. I was wrong. In my mid-20s, I built something remarkable. I didn't call it a company back then. It was just an idea that grew faster than I expected. A framework that connected overlooked assets with underutilized markets. Efficient, scalable, quietly disruptive. I was young, confident, and disastrously transparent. I shared too much. Trusted too easily. Believed collaboration meant shared respect. What actually happened was theft, legal, sanitized, and devastating. My work was absorbed into a larger firm. My name disappeared from documents. My role was reframed as support. When I objected, I was told I was emotional, difficult, unprofessional, sound familiar. I walked away with a modest settlement and a non-disclosure agreement that ensured one thing. I could never publicly claim what I had built, but I kept something far more valuable than credit. I kept the structure. I learned how to rebuild it in pieces, how to divide ownership, how to create distance between myself and the work so no single entity could erase me again. That was the moment I stopped announcing my strength. I learned to let others underestimate me, not as a defense, but as camouflage. So when I met Daniel years later, I had already perfected the art of appearing smaller than I was. I didn't tell him about the companies registered under holding groups. I didn't explain the revenue streams rooted through consulting agreements. I didn't mention the advisory roles I held anonymously, not because I didn't trust him, but because I trusted experience. My work was designed to survive without me being visible. That invisibility was the feature, not the flaw. Daniel didn't need to know. Margaret definitely didn't. By the time I married into the Whitmore family, my systems were already global, quietly profitable, legally airtight. I lived modestly on purpose. I dressed simply. I drove an unremarkable car. Power attracts attention, and attention invites interference. Margaret interfered with everything she could see, which is why she never touched what she couldn't. The secret I never spoke aloud was this: I owned far more than anyone in that family ever had. Not in flashy ways, not in ways that impressed dinner guests, but in ways that lasted. The irony still makes me smile sometimes. Margaret lectured me about contribution while unknowingly benefiting from my work. One of my holding groups supplied strategic consulting to a firm Richard's Foundation invested in. Another provided infrastructure services to a subsidiary Clara worked for. They never saw my name. They just saw results, and they assumed those results belonged to them. The night I realized Margaret's legacy was built partly on my invisible labor was the night my restraint hardened into resolve. I wasn't angry. I was curious. Because that meant Margaret wasn't just cruel. She was careless. She assumed ownership because she had never been challenged. And people like that always leave trails. I began reviewing public filings, charitable disclosures, corporate structures tied to the Whitmore name. What I found didn't shock me. It explained everything. Margaret wasn't just influential. She was a gatekeeper. For years, she had positioned herself as the silent partner in ventures she didn't fully own, leveraging reputation instead of capital, control instead of accountability. She blurred lines intentionally, redirected credit, obscured responsibility. And now she was doing the same thing to me. The difference was I knew exactly how that game worked. I had survived it once. This time I had leverage. I didn't confront her. I didn't change my behavior. I simply stopped protecting her narrative. I let small truths surface. Let other people connect dots, and Margaret noticed. She began asking questions, subtle ones at first. Who do you consult for these days? Do you work with many international firms? Do you ever think about formalizing your work? I answered honestly, but incompletely. I advise, I said. I structure. I prefer not to be public-facing. That answer unsettled her, because it didn't fit the story she'd told everyone else. Margaret needed me to be dependent. But dependence doesn't come with options, and I had plenty. The secret I never spoke aloud wasn't just about wealth or ownership. It was about patience. I had waited years to reclaim what was taken from me, not by force, but by precision. And now, I was sitting inside the Whitmore family, watching history repeat itself from the safest seat possible. They thought I was invisible. They didn't realize invisibility was how I saw everything. And Margaret was standing at the center of a con she believed was untouchable. She just didn't know who was holding the mirror. I've never been the type to brag. Even now, as I sit across from Margaret at yet another dinner where she's already decided my worth, I still don't need to. Because the work speaks louder than any speech ever could. Before anyone knew my name, I had built a network that spanned continents. Not flashy, not headline-grabbing, but essential. Every day, hundreds of decisions happened because of systems I created, systems invisible to everyone except me. When people say, "Who are you in this world?" they usually mean, "Who do you know?" But I've always believed that power isn't about who knows you. It's about who depends on you. That morning, I sat in my home office, reviewing contracts from Hong Kong, London, and New York. Daniel thought I was working on small projects. Margaret thought I was invisible. Both were wrong. One of my holdings controlled proprietary consulting data that many firms relied on. Another managed infrastructure logistics for clients who didn't even know my name. A third held minority stakes in a startup Daniel's father had once tried to invest in and missed. I smiled, quietly. They had no idea that every subtle move Margaret made to demonstrate superiority, the dinner table comparisons, the whispered critiques, the gentle public humiliation, wasn't shaping me. It was strengthening me. Every attempt to minimize me, every calculated oversight, had given me the time and space to expand, refine, and cement control without interference. The Whitmores were confident in their narrative. I was small, gentle, contained, perfectly safe, perfectly irrelevant. And yet their entire family's small empire, their charitable foundations, even some of Daniel's lucrative deals, relied on the exact same mechanisms I had designed. I didn't intervene, not yet. I watched, I studied, I observed, because the most dangerous moves are never sudden, they're inevitable. That week, Margaret organized a gala, a charity fundraiser, polished to the point of perfection. She invited key business leaders, socialites, and media contacts. She expected everyone to admire her organization skills, her poise, her careful orchestration. And in her mind, I was just attending. The moment I arrived, the room's dynamics shifted, though no one noticed. I greeted old clients in private corners. I confirmed logistics with service providers who, unknown to Margaret, had contracts routed through my holding companies. I adjusted minor scheduling conflicts on the fly. Everything seamless. Everything invisible. Margaret's hand hovered over me several times, ready to insert her opinion, ready to guide me like she always did. But I didn't need guidance. I controlled the system. Every time she moved, I had anticipated it and mitigated any disruption. By the end of the evening, guests were complimenting her on a flawless event. But quietly, a few had sent me follow-up emails, asking questions she couldn't answer. Questions about vendors, timing, logistics. Small inquiries seemingly innocent, but they were gateways into my network. Margaret thought she was omnipotent. She never was. That night, I drove home in silence, thinking of all the years I had spent being underestimated. All the dinners I had endured, all the comparisons, all the passive-aggressive lessons about how women should behave. Every word she had said, every smirk, every sigh, it had taught me something. And now everything had changed. I had the power. I had control. And for the first time, I was going to act without apology, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in precision. I would not make a scene. I would not confront Margaret directly. Instead, I would let the structures I built speak for themselves. And when the moment came, the truth would hit like a revelation, quiet, undeniable, and irreversible. Because Margaret's entire identity was based on perception. My identity was based on results. And results, unlike words or status, cannot be ignored. That night, I allowed myself one thought: this is only the beginning. Margaret Whitmore believed perfection was her armor. Polished dinners, flawless charity events, sharp outfits, tighter smiles, everything choreographed so no one could ever question her. She thrived on appearances. People trusted the story she told about herself and her family because it looked unassailable. But perfection is fragile. It only takes a small fissure to start a cascade. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A vendor at the gala asked a question Margaret couldn't answer. I noticed the hesitation, the slight flush in her cheeks, the way she glanced toward me almost instinctively. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My network handled the question within minutes, invisible, seamless. The room never knew anything had been off, but I did. The cracks widened at the next family dinner. Margaret was discussing the upcoming donation schedule for her foundation, casually reminding everyone how she was managing everything personally. I nodded politely, letting her speak. She had no idea that the foundation's funding and project implementation were largely being routed through consulting agreements I controlled, agreements she had never even been included in. Later, I overheard a whispered conversation between Clara and one of her friends. "I don't understand," Clara said. "Some of the contractors she's recommending, I thought Mom had approved everything." "Apparently, she doesn't," the friend replied. Margaret wasn't aware that I had orchestrated those very recommendations to appear as if they were independent. To outside eyes, it looked like a hiccup in her otherwise flawless network. But I knew it was the beginning of a chain reaction. By this point, even Daniel had started noticing subtle inconsistencies. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he caught glimpses of Margaret's uncertainty, small comments that didn't match her usual confidence. Slight hesitation before she responded to questions, micro-expressions of unease when people asked about vendors or timelines. I sat silently, observing everything, letting it unfold. Margaret's control depended entirely on others believing she was the sole authority. Once that illusion faltered, she lost power. And the way I saw it, illusions are like mirrors. The reflection can only last until someone stops holding it up. The first time I let someone else see me as I really was, it happened by accident, or maybe by design. One of the charity board members approached me privately. "Elena," he said quietly, "you've done amazing work coordinating this. How do you manage to make it all so seamless?" I smiled faintly, careful. "It's a team effort," I said, echoing Margaret's phrasing. But I didn't redirect all the credit to her. I let him sense that I had a hand in it. Later, at the end of the evening, Daniel said, "People are talking about you. I think they finally understand what you do." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Sometimes, being invisible lets people see more clearly." Daniel looked at me curiously. He didn't realize that Margaret's empire, her control, her narrative, her supposed perfection, was quietly dependent on my work. He didn't realize that the cracks forming around her were because of me, because I had chosen when and how to let them appear. And Margaret still didn't see it. That was the beauty of timing. People underestimate quiet power because it doesn't demand attention. They assume that what they can't see doesn't exist, but quiet power observes everything. It waits. And when the time is right, it reveals itself, not with noise, but with inevitability. The first crack had appeared. The illusion was beginning to crumble. And I smiled to myself, knowing that once perception shifted, everything would follow. Because Margaret's perfect image wasn't based on competence. It was based on control, and control, unlike skill or intelligence, is fragile. And I had all the time in the world. It's funny how people can believe a lie for decades, not because the lie is clever. Not because it's complicated, but because it's convenient. Margaret Whitmore's entire life was built on convenience, on appearances, on control disguised as care. On narratives that painted her as the selfless, brilliant matriarch who kept everything running flawlessly. And for years, no one questioned it. Not Daniel, not Clara, not even Richard. But the truth had been there all along. I discovered it almost by accident. One evening, I was reviewing some old corporate filings for a consulting client. A minor task, routine. But my attention wandered when I noticed a pattern. A series of investments tied to the Whitmore name, all channeling through third-party accounts and shell entities. It didn't make sense, at least, not according to the story Margaret told publicly. Margaret claimed she had built the family foundation from scratch, that she oversaw every project personally, that she had earned her influence through decades of tireless work. But the records told a different story. Large donations had been made under her name, but the funds originated from entities she didn't legally control. Some had been in place long before she joined the foundation. Others came from subsidiaries managed entirely outside her oversight. She had leveraged other people's capital to construct an image of omnipotence. In other words, she had spent years taking credit for work she didn't do. And everyone, family, friends, colleagues, believed her. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. It wasn't a revelation. I had suspected Margaret was manipulative for years, but seeing it documented, seeing it concretely, it was almost delicious. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to humiliate her, at least, not yet, but because the pieces of the puzzle suddenly made sense. All of those dinners, all of those whispered remarks, all of those subtle jabs, they weren't random. They were strategic. Every word, every gesture, every smile was designed to reinforce her narrative while ensuring no one questioned it. Even Daniel, even Richard, even Clara. I felt a shiver of satisfaction. Quiet, calm. Invisible. Because while Margaret had built her empire on illusion, I had been building mine on substance. The contrast was intoxicating. For weeks, I studied the documents, cross-referenced foundations, traced the flow of funds, and quietly mapped her network. I didn't need anyone to know I was doing it. I didn't need anyone to help me. I just observed, took notes, and let the picture emerge. And the more I discovered, the more I understood the full extent of her deception. It wasn't just financial. It was social, emotional, psychological. Margaret had trained the family and everyone else around her to believe that she was indispensable, that she was flawless, that she could do no wrong. She had positioned herself as the arbiter of success, the gatekeeper of opportunity, the voice of reason. And by doing so, she had ensured that anyone who might challenge her either felt grateful, intimidated, or both. But here's the thing about lies. They only work until someone sees the cracks. And I was seeing them. The first subtle signs came at a casual dinner. Margaret, as always, was narrating her own importance, carefully highlighting projects she had supposedly managed personally. Her words were flawless, her timing impeccable. Everyone nodded, impressed, or so it seemed. But I noticed a minor inconsistency, a reference to a consultant she claimed she had supervised, a name, a date. Neither aligned with the records I had quietly gathered. I didn't say anything. I simply made a mental note. Later, when Clara made an offhand comment about how Mom handles contracts personally, I smiled faintly. Interesting, I said. I thought some of those projects were managed by external consultants. Clara frowned, confused. She glanced at Margaret. Margaret laughed lightly, a sound meant to diffuse tension. But I saw it, the brief flash of uncertainty. She hadn't expected anyone to challenge her narrative, not in front of witnesses, not casually, and certainly not someone she thought small. I let it ride. I didn't push further. Because here's what I had learned over years of being underestimated. Confrontation isn't the most effective strategy. Observation is. Patience is. Timing is everything. And Margaret's timing was about to fail her. Over the next few weeks, I allowed small hints to surface naturally. At a board meeting for the foundation, I asked innocent-sounding questions that highlighted inconsistencies in her past reports. I requested documentation that she assumed I didn't have access to. I spoke to vendors, quietly verifying information she had presented as her own. Each time, she responded flawlessly on the surface. Each time, she smiled, reassured everyone, and maintained her image. But behind closed doors, the cracks grew. Small, almost imperceptible, but growing nonetheless. And the beauty of it was that no one blamed me. No one suspected my involvement. They thought the inconsistencies were random, administrative errors, minor oversights. In truth, they were the first dominoes falling. Daniel noticed them too, though he didn't fully understand. One evening, he asked me quietly, "Do you think Mom really handles everything herself?" I smiled faintly. "I've always wondered," I said. That was all. He didn't press further. But the seed had been planted. Margaret, meanwhile, was working harder than ever to maintain control. She micromanaged minor details, triple-checked reports, followed up constantly. But the effort was too little, too late. Her web was fragile, and the foundation of her authority had quietly shifted. Because the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to exist. And once it exists, people see it. I realized in that moment that the long-running con Margaret relied on wasn't just about her. It was about perception, about narrative, about the willingness of others to believe what they wanted to believe. And when that willingness falters, the illusion collapses. By the end of that month, Several people had come to me privately with questions, questions Margaret had never expected. Questions about contracts, vendors, timelines, and approvals. Small questions, innocuous enough on their own. But together, they formed a pattern, a subtle revelation that not everything Margaret claimed as hers was truly hers. I didn't answer everything fully. I gave just enough to satisfy curiosity while maintaining discretion. And with each answer, I watched Margaret's influence quietly erode. She was still the matriarch. She was still respected. But the cracks were visible now, and everyone around her could feel them, even if they didn't consciously acknowledge it. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of liberation. Not because I had power yet, not because I had exposed her, not because I had taken revenge, but because the illusion was finally breaking, and I was ready to decide how to shape what came next. I had spent years being underestimated. I had spent years being ignored. I had spent years observing, learning, and building. And now, the stage was set. Margaret Whitmore had built her empire on lies, and for the first time, I could see it clearly. I walked into the Whitmore estate one evening and realized something immediately. No one expected me to be here. It wasn't the house. They had seen me countless times. It wasn't my face. They had looked at me every week for years. It was the energy I carried. I had changed. Quietly, deliberately. Not outwardly, not with flashy clothes or loud declarations. But in the way I held myself, the way my presence demanded attention without asking for it. The invisibility I had mastered for years was gone. In its place, there was control, awareness, calm, power. Margaret noticed it first, of course. Her eyes flicked toward me as I entered the room, scanning me, measuring me, as if trying to identify what was different. She smiled. The polite, practiced smile she wore for the public, but it didn't reach her eyes. That flicker of uncertainty, the first I had ever seen directed at me, was delicious. Clara looked confused. "Elena." "You're here early," she said. Her tone suggested curiosity mixed with discomfort. Daniel glanced at me, almost startled. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us tonight." I smiled softly, folding my hands. "I thought I'd come in and help with the evening." Margaret's smile tightened. She stepped closer, subtly trying to reclaim the narrative. "Oh, that's thoughtful of you. I'm sure we can," I interrupted gently. "No, Margaret." "I've got it." The words were simple, but the weight behind them shifted the room. People paused. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even Richard's head tilted slightly, surprised at the calm authority in my tone. I began walking through the rooms, subtly taking stock. Vendors were late with a delivery. Tables were misaligned. A few schedules conflicted. Every small detail that Margaret would normally micromanage, I corrected quietly. No one noticed except those who were watching closely. Margaret tried to intervene a few times. She offered suggestions, corrections, advice, classic moves she had used on me for years. I acknowledged each politely, then implemented my own solution. I could see her uncertainty growing, though she fought to hide it. That evening, she realized for the first time that she wasn't in control. And the realization made her nervous in a way that no polite smile could conceal. Later, one of the board members approached me. "Elena," he said quietly, "I don't know how you did this, but everything is running perfectly." I smiled. "It's nothing. Just coordination." But the truth was, I had orchestrated everything from observation and planning, leveraging systems and knowledge that no one else could see. Margaret, meanwhile, was flustered. Every small mistake I corrected, every question I answered effortlessly, chipped at the perception she had built for decades. People were starting to notice. She wasn't omnipotent. She wasn't flawless. And quietly, subtly, I had entered the room as the force she had never anticipated. Daniel, sitting beside me at dinner later, whispered, "You've changed." "You're different." I looked at him and smiled faintly. "I've been building quietly for a long time. Now it's just time to act." No one yet knew the extent of my reach. Margaret assumed I was helpful because I cared, because I had always been compliant. But they didn't realize that I had always been watching, planning, and waiting. I had the power, the knowledge, the systems, and the room now understood without me saying a word that the quiet woman they had dismissed, the wife who didn't do much, the one they assumed was harmless, was no longer invisible. Margaret tried to recover control, offering instructions, smiling more forcefully than ever. But the cracks were visible. Her narrative was breaking. People were noticing small inconsistencies she had always buried effortlessly. And for the first time, she couldn't spin it away. That evening ended quietly, without confrontation. No one left humiliated, no one openly embarrassed, but the balance had shifted. I returned to the Whitmore world not with noise or fury, but with presence, observation, precision. And Margaret, for all her years of control, still didn't understand. She had trained me to be small. I had complied. And all those years of being underestimated had prepared me for this moment. The room may have seen the same person they had always known, but they didn't recognize the woman who now walked among them. A woman with quiet power, invisible yet indispensable, calm yet unshakable. And for the first time, I felt the exhilaration of inevitability. Because in the world Margaret had built, perception was everything. And now, the perception had shifted. The lie she had relied upon for decades, the illusion that she was the untouchable matriarch, the arbiter of every decision, was cracking. And I was the quiet catalyst. That night, I returned not as the timid, underestimated wife. I returned as the woman she had dismissed for years. The woman who had already outbuilt, outmaneuvered, and outlasted her expectations. And they hadn't even realized it yet. It happened at the charity gala. Margaret had orchestrated the event flawlessly, or at least she thought she had. Silver trays, floral arrangements, champagne towers, speeches rehearsed down to the syllable. She was the star of the evening, and she expected everyone to see her that way. But I had arrived early, as always, quietly correcting small mistakes she didn't notice. Staff schedules, lighting, vendor placements, all handled seamlessly. No one saw me. No one needed to. Until the moment came. A media reporter, someone Margaret had cultivated for months, approached her with questions about the foundation's logistics. She smiled, ready with her rehearsed answers. And then he turned to me. "Elena," he asked casually, "I understand you coordinated much of tonight's event." Margaret froze. A micro-expression flashed across her face, shock, disbelief, panic. She tried to redirect attention back to herself, the matriarch, the untouchable orchestrator. I simply assisted," I said softly, letting the understatement do the work. The reporter pressed gently, not aggressively. "The organization was seamless. I assume this was your planning." Margaret's carefully curated smile faltered. The room shifted. Guests who had been complimenting her earlier were now exchanging glances. Murmurs began. Nothing loud, nothing overt, but perception had begun to change. Margaret tried to recover. "Elena just helped coordinate a few minor details," she said, voice a shade too tight. "The planning was a team effort." I didn't correct her. I didn't need to. People could see the truth. By the end of the night, whispers followed Margaret everywhere. Board members asked me questions privately, complimenting me on the seamless execution. Vendors approached me for clarifications. Guests commented on my poise and organizational skill. The perception Margaret had maintained for decades, the illusion of perfection and singular control, was quietly crumbling. And Margaret. She realized it. The subtle tension, the misplaced compliments, the questions she couldn't answer, it all added up. She knew something had shifted. The matriarch, untouchable and revered for so long, was losing her grip. I left the gala the same way I arrived, quietly, calmly, unseen by most. But the difference this time was that I had made myself visible without saying a word. My work, my competence, my presence, these spoke for me. And everyone, Margaret included, noticed. For the first time, the room recognized me not as the quiet, underestimated wife, but as a woman with power they could no longer ignore. And Margaret, for all her preparation, had no defense. The reckoning had begun. It didn't happen with a speech. It didn't happen with confrontation. I never raised my voice. It happened quietly, systematically, with facts. The next week, a meeting was scheduled with the Foundation's board. Margaret expected me to attend politely, nod quietly, and follow instructions. That had always been my role. The underestimated, invisible presence, the background, but I had other plans. I had compiled documents, contracts, filings, emails, and vendor confirmations. Every piece of evidence showed exactly what Margaret had orchestrated and what she hadn't. How funds had been funneled, who had actually implemented projects, and where credit had been misappropriated. I began presenting the information casually, as if it were routine. I thought it might help clarify some of the past projects, I said, sliding a neatly organized folder across the table. The room went quiet. Board members flipped through pages. They glanced at each other. Margaret's expression changed slowly, from polite confidence to shock to disbelief. She opened her mouth, but no words came. "Wait," she finally stammered. This isn't accurate." I met her eyes, calm, unflinching. "These are records directly from the financial filings, internal reports, and vendor communications. You may want to review them carefully." People began asking questions, simple ones at first. Who coordinated this project? Who managed this vendor? Who approved this schedule? Each answer confirmed what was already in the documents. Margaret's name had been attached to projects she hadn't managed. Decisions she claimed to have made had been handled by me or by staff under my guidance. The realization settled over the room slowly but unmistakably. Margaret had built a narrative over decades, a careful web of perception and influence, and I had just untangled it in plain sight. The tension was exquisite. Board members whispered to each other. Vendors subtly confirmed what I had said. Even Daniel's face shifted from polite confusion to stunned recognition. Margaret tried to recover, to redirect blame, to explain inconsistencies, but the facts were clear. Each attempt only made the cracks more visible. Her long-running con, the illusion of flawless control, competence, and authority, was exposed. And I did it without raising my voice, without humiliation, without theatrics. Just truth, just timing. The room didn't need me to declare victory. They saw it themselves. The quiet, underestimated woman, the one Margaret had dismissed for years, had orchestrated the exposure, and no one could deny it. Margaret slumped slightly in her chair, the polished matriarch suddenly human, suddenly vulnerable. She looked around the table as people processed what I had revealed. For the first time, she was no longer untouchable, and I remained calm. Silent power finally recognized. The room was silent. Margaret Whitmore, who had ruled every conversation, every event, every perception for decades, sat stunned. Her carefully constructed persona, the untouchable matriarch, the orchestrator of success, was no longer believable, and she knew it. No one needed to say anything aloud. The whispers, the glances, the subtle nods, they told the story for me. I leaned back slightly in my chair, calm, collected, visible for the first time in years, but never loud, never aggressive. I let the truth speak, let the documents speak, let the undeniable evidence create the shift. Margaret tried one last move, a feeble attempt at charm. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," she said, voice trembling slightly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The board, the vendors, even Daniel, everyone had already drawn their conclusions. Margaret's narrative had crumbled, and my presence was the subtle force that made it happen. Later, after the meeting, I walked through the halls of the Foundation quietly. Staff nodded, some tentatively, some with newfound respect. Daniel followed me, eyes wide, a mix of awe and relief. "Elena, I didn't realize." "You didn't need to," I said softly. "I've been building quietly for a long time. Now it's just time to act responsibly." Because this wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. About reclaiming space in a world that had tried to dismiss me. About proving, finally, that power doesn't announce itself. It waits, invisible, until the moment is right. Margaret's authority wasn't gone entirely. People were polite. Public smiles remained. But the illusion, the one that allowed her to control, manipulate, and dominate, had shattered, and she knew it. I had regained my dignity quietly, deliberately, and irreversibly. No shouting, no public confrontation, just observation, strategy, and patience. That night, as I left the building, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph in the loud sense, not satisfaction in vengeance, but a profound sense of inevitability fulfilled. Margaret had underestimated me for decades. She had assumed my silence was weakness. She had assumed my invisibility meant compliance. And while she played her games, I had built quietly, invisibly, untouchably. And now the world, her world, Daniel's world, the family she had dominated, finally recognized it. I walked out into the night, calm, collected, unstoppable. Quiet power doesn't scream. It waits, it observes, it acts. And I had waited perfectly. The underestimated woman was finally seen. And no one, not Margaret, not Clara, not even Daniel, would ever doubt her strength again.